Hello, and welcome to Thinkling's Books. My name is Deborah, and today we're going to be talking about what makes good exposition. Now, generally speaking, when discussing this topic, there are two rules of thumb to follow. The first is that exposition should be a natural, organic part of the story, not bring the story grinding to a halt or take the reader out of it so they say to themselves, "My goodness, that was an exposition dump." The second major rule is that you shouldn't explain anything that you don't actually need to explain. If you treat your reader as intelligent and able to follow along with your world, for the most part they will. You don't have to tell them every little detail. So in order to show you how the different types of exposition interact and how you can put a lot of information out there for your reader, I'm going to first go through the three major types of exposition, which are explicit exposition, implicit exposition, and non-exposition, and then give a story example to show how they interact. Let's start with explicit exposition. Explicit exposition is when you tell the reader something straight out. For example, let's say that we want to exposit that turning into a werewolf is painful. Using explicit exposition, we could say, "Jimmy went to the old werewolf. Turn me into a werewolf," he said. "You don't want that," said the old werewolf. "Turning into a werewolf is painful." Or, "You don't want that," said the werewolf, and Jimmy knew he was referring to how painful it was to turn into a werewolf. In both examples, you're clearly, very explicitly, telling the reader turning into a werewolf is painful. Explicit exposition is by far the most intrusive of the three types of exposition, and it should therefore be used the least, because when you use more than one or at most two sentences of explicit exposition for any certain thing that you are expositing, it becomes very noticeable. And if you have a lot of it, it's what we call an exposition dump, because it feels like you're dumping exposition on the reader. That being said, explicit exposition is an essential part of good writing because it presents small amounts of information in a way that can't be mistaken, and it can be shocking, and it can make sure your reader doesn't misunderstand something important. It can be shocking because explicit exposition can be used to take a lot of information and a lot of implicit and non-exposition that's been built up and present it to the reader in an aha moment. For example, in Star Wars, we learn a lot about Luke's backstory. We hear this about his father, that about his father. We have these hints. We see these strange things with Darth Vader. But we don't all put it together in that aha and moment until, "No, Luke, I am your father." It is such a powerful line. And wouldn't it have been ruined if Darth Vader had then gone on to explain everything? I mean, poor Luke. You have just been like, "Oh my gosh, Dad, that's so embarrassing. It's such bad writing." So the other place it can be used is to make sure that the reader absolutely, totally understands something. And interestingly enough, the place where I see confusion from exposition most often has to do with emotional sequences. Because when the reader is super invested in what's going on and their feelings are invested, most readers tend to assume that how a character reacts is how they would react if they felt the same way. For example, let's say that the old werewolf became Jimmy's mentor and then died, and Jimmy reacts by screaming and kicking the body. Now, a reader who has a lot of experience with transforming grief into anger in order to cope with it would see this as a sign of Jimmy's great distress. And a reader who would react with sobbing would see this as proof that Jimmy was actually just a cold, horrible person who never actually cared about his mentor, and oh my gosh, now he's abusing the body. What is wrong with this person? And it's really hard for the writer to tell how the reader is going to react, because of course the writer knows, my character is feeling this. Aren't his emotions just pouring onto the page? Sometimes, sometimes not. The best way to tell if you need a line of explicit exposition to clue the reader into what's actually going on is through the use of beta readers or critiquers. I'll go into this more in a future video, but to be short, I recommend 3 critiquers for each draft of the story that you're having critiqued, because you want the different viewpoints from different sorts of people to know what different sorts of people might miss. And if you ask specifically, does my character, ever seem emotionally cold or to react in a way that's out of character or unpleasant or not how you would have reacted or you don't understand it? And if your critiquers ever that his motivations and reactions are not what they were expecting, or that they were otherwise than you intended them to be, you might just need to rewrite the scene, or you might need to add in a single line of exposition saying something along the lines of, Jimmy was devastated, so devastated he just couldn't handle it and so forced himself to be angry instead. Explicit exposition can be essential when used properly. Now let's talk about types of exposition you can use a lot more than sentences in a row. The next type, which I would say has a medium level of intrusiveness, is implicit exposition. Implicit exposition is when you're still telling something, but you're disguising it a little bit instead of telling them straight out. To use our earlier example, I want to be a werewolf, said Jimmy. No, you don't, said the werewolf, his careworn face etched deeply with the years of pain. Or, I want to be a werewolf, said Jimmy. No, you don't. I'm doing the same one twice. I want to be a werewolf, said Jimmy. Have you ever stepped on a nail? Said the old werewolf. Have you ever had your skin boil from your bones? Has every bone in your body suddenly twisted and torn apart? You don't know what pain is. You don't know what you're asking for. Again, the message is clear. Turning into a werewolf is really painful, but it's not stated straight out. And because this sort of exposition isn't stated straight out, and it's less intrusive and less obvious, you can have several paragraphs or even a couple of pages of it before it starts feeling like an exposition dump. And perhaps more importantly, you can use implicit exposition to surround your explicit exposition so that your explicit exposition can, well, it's like the summing up in a mystery novel. It's like, you have all these facts, now let's bring them to light with a single line of explicit exposition. Whodunit? But although implicit exposition is less intrusive than explicit, it's still exposition. And therefore, for the vast majority of your world building and of what's going on, your best bet is non-exposition. Or in other words, just don't explain. Just throw your reader into the story and expect they're just going to keep up. One of the very best examples I've seen in this is Diana Wynne Jones's Dog's Body. Fabulous book. It begins with the dog star Sirius on trial with some unnamed judges accusing him of something to do with the Zoe. And Sirius, being outraged and feeling this is very unjust, and he's sentenced and condemned to Earth. How are stars alive? Why do they have this judicial system, and what's it about? What's the Zoe? What's going on? We know what's going on. We're all familiar with the judicial setup, and we're familiar with the feelings of confusion and betrayal and injustice. We are given enough to care and to follow along without the narrative being halted with a whole bunch of explanation. To take us back to our earlier example, for non-exposition, I want to be a werewolf, said Jimmy. No, you don't, said the old werewolf. You're right, said Jimmy. I don't want to, but I have to. We're not told that being a werewolf is painful. Now, savvy readers of the genre may know that in many cases, werewolf transformation is described as being painful. And so for those readers, they might think, he's referring to the fact that it's painful. But regardless of the reader, it's clear that being a werewolf is something that no one in his right mind would actually want to become. We know there's something awful about it, but we're not sure exactly what. And so when the time comes for Jimmy to have his first transformation, we're worried about him, and we experience it for the same at the same time as him, with him, feeling his pain with him, instead of going, well, yeah, that went exactly how I thought it would. There's a time and a place for explaining to the reader what's going to happen, and maybe I'll talk about that in the future episode on building tension. But for the most part, a scene like that first transformation will be a lot more impactful if the reader doesn't know exactly what's going to happen ahead of time. There we have it. Our three major types of exposition. Explicit, where you tell the reader straight out. Implicit, where you disguise what you're telling the reader. And non-exposition, where you just assume that the reader is following along. I do want to give one more tip about writing non-exposition before I go on. The best way to write non-exposition is to assume that the information that you would think to exposit is already known to the reader. Let's take the example of, say you're writing in English, perhaps for a primarily American audience, and you want to exposit for some reason that the American currency is the dollar. So Jimmy goes into the grocery store and buys a bag of apples for $5. $5 are the American currency. When you break it up into smaller than dollars, it's called... Why are you telling the reader this? They already know. Don't tell the reader things they already know, or that they can easily figure out. Jimmy, in the made-up country of Alferia, went into the grocery store and bought a bag of apples for 5 glubliglots. What's a glubliglot? Bet you already know the answer to that. Glubliglot's the currency. We don't need to be told. The reader isn't stupid. Trust them. And they'll trust you. So there we go. There are major types of exposition. How are they all used together? Well, generally speaking, for any one piece of exposition, you want to build a mountain shape, like this, in which this is non-exposition, implicit, and a single pinnacle of explicit exposition. Harry Potter does this very well. Let's go with the first Harry Potter book. Minimal spoilers. Click away now if you don't want to know that Harry is a wizard. Okay. So let's say that we want to discuss, that we want to exposit that Harry is a wizard and all that that means. The exposition about this starts at the very beginning of the book, because we see wizards and we see how they act and we see what sort of clothes they wear. We don't know yet that wizards is what they are, but it will all become clear. So we see people that we later learn are wizards. We see weird stuff happening. All these letters start to appear, and it's clear that the Dursleys know something about it, and they're frightened and they're angry. Finally, they run away to a shack on the sea, and Harry doesn't know what's going on. He knows, or rather, he doesn't know why it's going on. We're following along what's going on, his confusion. But it's all non-exposition until Hagrid arrives. And then we move into implicit exposition. Through dialogue, mainly Hagrid arguing with Dursleys and being surprised that Harry doesn't already know all of this, we start to learn a bit more about what's actually going on. But we don't bring it together. We don't fully understand it until the one famous line of explicit exposition, which is, "You're a wizard, Harry." After which, we go back into implicit exposition, more arguing with the Dursleys, and then right back into non-exposition as we just continue following Harry around. Very little is explained to Harry at this point. We don't even know Voldemort's name. We certainly don't know he's after Harry. We don't know Harry's famous. We don't know what kinds of magic wizards and witches can do, although we have a couple of hints. Not a lot is explained, but enough is explained. And then we can go on to, again, learn things through following Harry. Whenever there's a major reveal like this, or even sometimes you can do it in a shorter way, not the entire first third of the book, I recommend using the mountain, or maybe the concentric circle pattern, where on both sides the vast majority is non-exposition, and you have a page on each side of implicit, and a single line, or at the very most 2 lines, of explicit exposition. I hope you found this informative or helpful, and if you did, please hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell to learn about new videos. If you have any comments or any thoughts of your own about what makes great exposition, please begin a conversation down in the comments. I read all comments and will do my best to respond. Until next time.